The village of Wych Elm had arranged its spring fete with the sort of care usually reserved for weddings and funerals. By 3:30, the bunting stirred above the green, the tea urn hissed steadily beneath the striped canvas tent, and the vicar's wife had already declared twice that nothing brought people together like a charitable purpose. Miss Marple, seated a little apart with her teacup balanced neatly on one gloved hand, thought that many things brought people together: curiosity, resentment, fear. A fete, in her experience, merely gave them chairs and sponge cake. The afternoon had the softness of early May. Children ran past with paper windmills. Elderly men in Panama hats discussed the weather as if it had personally offended them in previous years. At the cake stall, Mrs. Pritchard watched a plate of seed cakes with the vigilance of a woman guarding state secrets. Miss Marple observed it all with mild blue eyes that missed very little. Near the flower display stood Mrs. Lavinia Trent, widow of the late solicitor, and the acknowledged patroness of everything worth acknowledging in Wych Elm. She wore dove-grey silk and an expression of gracious endurance, as though village life depended entirely on her willingness to tolerate it. People deferred to her without appearing to do so. "She has the air," murmured Miss Marple to herself, "of a woman accustomed to arranging other people's lives." At that moment Mrs. Trent was speaking to Dr. Julian Ware, a handsome man of 40 with sleek dark hair and a soothing professional voice. He bent his head courteously, but his smile did not reach his eyes. A little distance away, his sister, Miss Eleanor Ware, stood rigid beside the white elephant stall, one hand resting on a box of chipped porcelain. She had the stillness of someone listening too closely. Not far from them, Captain Hugo Fenwick laughed louder than the remark required. He was a broad-shouldered man with a military moustache and the easy manner of one who had learned to be agreeable because other talents were less dependable. He was talking to Sylvia Henshaw, the schoolmistress, whose calm face gave away almost nothing. Only her fingers, tightening briefly on the handle of her basket, suggested strain. "Everyone seems very cheerful," said a voice beside Miss Marple. She turned. Reverend Simon Bell had approached with the apologetic tread peculiar to clergymen entering social spaces where there might be jam. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though one does notice that cheerfulness is not always a sign of comfort." The vicar blinked. "No, some people become excessively pleasant when they are anxious." He followed her glance toward Captain Fenwick, who had just bowed over Sylvia Henshaw's hand with theatrical gallantry. "Oh," said the vicar, "you mean Hugo? Well, yes, he does lay it on a trifle thick." Miss Marple smiled. "Not only Captain Fenwick." On the platform at the far end of the green, Mrs. Trent rose to give a short address before the judging of the preserves. Her voice carried well, cultivated, low and firm. "My dear friends, it is heartening to see Wych Elm in such generous spirits. In times such as these one must remember the importance of community, of duty, of steadiness, of maintaining standards." There was polite applause. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Henshaw did not clap at once, nor did Dr. Ware. Eleanor Ware looked down at the grass. Mrs. Trent continued, "I should also like to thank those who have given their time despite personal inconveniences. Sacrifice, after all, is the foundation of decent society." That drew a few murmurs. Captain Fenwick shifted his weight. Sylvia Henshaw's face cooled by a degree. Near the tea tent, Mrs. Pritchard leaned toward her neighbour with the alertness of a terrier scenting blood. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Such speeches were often more informative than private letters. One learned whom a person wished to wound in public while appearing merely virtuous. When the address ended, the fete loosened again into chatter and movement. A small quartet of parish ladies began arranging cups for the next round of tea. The scent of cut grass mingled with warm currants and damp canvas. Mrs. Trent descended from the platform and passed near Miss Marple's table. "Miss Marple," she said, "how lovely to see you. You are looking very well." "How kind," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Trent's glance flickered over the field, quick and assessing. One does what one can to keep things from falling into disorder. "Yes," said Miss Marple, though disorder has a way of slipping in by the side entrance. For one brief instant something sharpened in the other woman's face, then the smile returned. "You always say such curious things. And yet they so often turn out to be true." Mrs. Trent moved on. The vicar gave a faint cough. "I hope you don't mind my saying so, Miss Marple, but Lavinia has been under some strain. Estate matters, committees, the usual sort of thing." "The usual sort of thing is often the most dangerous," said Miss Marple. A cry rose from the raffle table. Not alarm, only annoyance. One of the schoolboys had knocked over a tray of cups. The clatter scattered attention for a moment. Heads turned, voices rose, then settled. During that small confusion, Miss Marple saw Eleanor Ware cross quickly toward Mrs. Trent. The two women exchanged a few words. Eleanor's mouth barely moved. Mrs. Trent's expression did not alter, but her hand tightened on the handle of her parasol. Then Eleanor stepped back. A tiny scene, over in seconds, yet it carried a curious charge. Miss Marple set down her cup. The saucer showed a faint crescent of tea, untouched at one side, as though the cup had not been properly settled before serving. She looked toward the trestle where the tea things had been arranged. 6 cups in a row, sugar bowl, milk jug, spoons laid with village neatness. One spoon, however, was missing, not lost perhaps, merely absent. Miss Marple's gaze drifted farther. Dr. Ware had gone pale, though whether from heat or vexation it was impossible to say. Captain Fenwick was no longer laughing. Sylvia Henshaw stood very still indeed. Above the green, the bunting snapped once in a sudden breeze. Mrs. Trent had stopped beside the flower stall. A woman offered her a cup. She accepted it with absent grace, her eyes fixed not on the tea, but on Sylvia Henshaw across the lawn. Then, with the entire village moving gently around her in the sunlight, Lavinia Trent lifted the cup and drank. Miss Marple did not know why a faint uneasiness passed through her just then. Nothing had happened. Nothing at least that one could name, and yet the scene settled in her mind with unusual force. The missing spoon, Eleanor Ware's swift approach, the vicar's embarrassed loyalty, Lavinia Trent's public little cruelties scattered like pins in velvet. Ordinary people, Miss Marple reflected, rarely poisoned one another out of sudden passion. It was much more often done out of patience. Across the green, Mrs. Trent lowered her cup and put a hand briefly to her throat. Only the briefest gesture, so slight that anyone less observant might have missed it. Miss Marple did not miss it. She rose at once. Mrs. Trent's hand remained at her throat for a second, no more. Then the cup slipped from her fingers and shattered on the grass. The sound cut through the fate more sharply than the earlier clatter at the raffle table. Talk ceased. A child laughed, then stopped because no one else did. Lavinia Trent swayed once, as though annoyed by a passing dizziness, and sank heavily against the flower stall. Sweet peas toppled with her, their scent rising suddenly in the warm air. Dr. Julian Ware reached her first. "Stand back, please." His voice had changed. It no longer soothed, it commanded. The villagers obeyed at once, retreating with the clumsy haste of people drawn by horror but anxious to appear useful. Captain Fenwick pushed forward, his face stripped of colour. Sylvia Henshaw did not move. Eleanor Ware came on more slowly, though Miss Marple noticed that her hands were already clenched so tightly the knuckles showed white. Dr. Ware knelt beside Mrs. Trent. He touched her wrist, then looked quickly at her face. Something unreadable passed over his own. "Well?" Captain Fenwick demanded. Dr. Ware did not answer at once. "She's been unwell lately?" "No," snapped Ellen. "Certainly not." The vicar hovered uselessly near the overturned stall. "Should someone fetch the car? Take her home?" Dr. Ware's fingers shifted to Mrs. Trent's neck. "No, she must be taken inside. Somewhere quiet. At once." Miss Marple had come nearer without seeming to do so. Lavinia Trent's eyes were half open, but they lacked focus. Her breathing was shallow. One gloved hand twitched against the grass, catching on a fallen stem of delphinium. "Was it her heart?" whispered Mrs. Pritchard to nobody in particular. "Hush," said the vicar's wife, instantly alert to every syllable. Captain Fenwick bent down. "Lavinia, can you hear me?" Mrs. Trent's lips moved. A dry sound emerged, too faint to be a word. Then she gave a small convulsive shudder. Dr. Ware rose to his feet with controlled speed. "We'll take her to the vestry room in the church hall. Hugo, help me." Between them, they lifted her carefully. The crowd drew back, parting in the uneasy silence. A few women crossed themselves by habit rather than conviction. Others began speaking in low bursts, the kind of whispers that travelled farther than ordinary conversation. Miss Marple stooped. At the edge of the broken cup lay a darkened patch where the tea had soaked into the grass. One fragment still held a stain along its rim, slightly brown, slightly cloudy. Not remarkable in itself. Tea left all manner of marks. Yet Miss Marple regarded it for a moment longer than such a thing deserved. Beside her, Sylvia Henshaw said quietly, "Do you think she's dying?" The voice was steady. Only the slowness of the words betrayed effort. Miss Marple looked up. "I hope not." Sylvia's gaze remained on the church hall where the men had carried Mrs. Trent. "Many people won't hope so." "No," said Miss Marple, "that is often the difficulty." Sylvia turned to her then. She was a composed woman, perhaps in her early 30s, with sensible shoes and a face that might have seemed severe if not for the intelligence in it. "You speak as though you know the village already. My dear, villages are much the same everywhere. Only the upholstery changes." A flicker, almost a smile, touched Sylvia's mouth. Then it vanished. From the tea tent, Mrs. Pritchard was already gathering details into herself like a woman collecting eggs before a storm. She looked perfectly well at luncheon, she told Mrs. Bell. Perfectly. Though I did say she had overdone things. Ladies of that sort always do. "Of what sort?" asked Miss Marple mildly, arriving at her elbow. Mrs. Pritchard started. "Oh, well, energetic, determined, used to having their own way." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And was she having it today?" Mrs. Pritchard's eyes brightened at the invitation. "There have been words here and there. Nothing open, of course, but Miss Eleanor has been queer all week, and Captain Fenwick looked ready to jump out of his skin when Mrs. Trent mentioned sacrifice. And that schoolmistress—" She stopped. "Yes," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Pritchard lowered her voice. Mrs. Trent had a way of making people uncomfortable. Quite genteelly, you understand. Miss Marple understood very well. A little apart from the others, Eleanor Ware stood motionless beside the preserve table. One jar of damson jelly had been knocked askew. She righted it without seeming aware of what she did. Dr. Ware emerged from the church hall and crossed the green toward her. "Well," she said at once, "not here." "Julian." "Not here," he repeated. She stared at him for a beat, and in that beat something passed between them older than the afternoon's distress. Not affection exactly, nor open fear. Complicity, perhaps, or the exhaustion that follows too many shared difficulties. Then Dr. Ware noticed Miss Marple watching, and altered his expression with professional neatness. "There has been a collapse," he announced to the nearest cluster of villagers. "Possibly cardiac. Mrs. Trent must rest and be kept from agitation." "Will she recover?" asked the vicar. "I cannot say yet." That answer spread quickly and changed as it went. By the time it reached the far cake stall, it had become, "Dr. Ware says she may not last the evening." Miss Marple turned toward the tea table. Cups remained where they had been left in the confusion. The linen cloth had shifted crookedly. Sugar glittered in a small spill near the bowl, and there, tucked half behind the milk jug, lay the missing spoon. She paused. It had not been there before. No one appeared to notice it but herself. Mrs. Bell was gathering saucers. A parish girl was collecting napkins. The spoon looked no different from any other silver-plated village spoon. Slightly worn, its handle rubbed thin by years of use. Yet its sudden reappearance struck Miss Marple as faintly theatrical. Objects, when they vanished and returned within minutes, usually did so for human reasons. She did not touch it. Instead, she said to the parish girl, "My dear, would you be so good as to ask the vicar not to let anything on this table be cleared away just yet? Dr. Ware may wish to see it." The girl blinked. "The tea things, miss?" "Yes, exactly the tea things." The child ran off, glad of importance. Behind Miss Marple, Captain Fenwick came out of the church hall alone. He strode a few paces, then stopped as though he had forgotten where to go. His military self-possession had deserted him completely. He took out a cigarette, failed to light it twice, and finally crushed it in his hand. Sylvia Henshaw approached him. "Any news?" He gave a harsh little laugh. "Only that everything is infernally worse than it was an hour ago. That tells me very little." He looked at her then, really looked, and Miss Marple saw that his distress was tangled with anger. "Doesn't it?" Sylvia's face hardened. "Not unless one enjoys speaking in riddles." Before he could answer, Eleanor Ware's voice cut across the green. "Captain Fenwick." He turned at once. "Dr. Ware would like a word." Fenwick hesitated, just enough to be noticeable. Then he went back toward the church hall without replying to Sylvia at all. Miss Marple folded her hands. A collapse at a village fete could be natural. A heart might fail in public as easily as in private. Yet the afternoon had altered in shape. Beneath the concern, beneath the fluttering charity banners and abandoned cakes, something more concentrated had begun to show itself. Not grief, not yet, but calculation. People were remembering what they had said to Lavinia Trent, what she had said to them. Who had handed her the cup, who had stood near enough to be seen. The church clock struck 4. At that moment the side door of the hall opened again, and Dr. Ware stepped out, grave and pale. He looked over the gathered villagers before speaking. "I am sorry," he said. "Mrs. Trent is dead." No one moved. Then, from somewhere in the stillness, a jar slipped from the preserve table and smashed on the stones. Miss Marple's eyes went not to the broken glass, but to the faces around her. Shock, certainly. But on one face, only for an instant, she saw relief. The church hall, ordinarily a place of measured calm, had become a theatre of muted panic. Chairs had been pushed aside. The smell of overbrewed tea mingled with spilled sugar and the faint tang of flowers from the toppled displays outside. Miss Marple, standing near the doorway, noted every detail with quiet precision. Dr. Julian Ware moved among the villagers with the efficiency of a surgeon. "Please remain calm," he said, though his voice carried the faint tremor of strain. "It is essential that we preserve order." Captain Hugo Fenwick leaned against the wall, trying to appear composed, yet his jaw tightened every time someone spoke of Mrs. Trent. He glanced at Eleanor Ware, who remained near the back, her posture rigid, hands clasped in front of her, betraying nothing. A low murmur rose from the women gathered near the tea stall. "I can't believe it," Mrs. Pritchard whispered. "Dead, at a fete. It's unthinkable." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "but the impossible often hides the truth more comfortably than the ordinary." The vicar, Reverend Simon Bell, stood in the centre of the hall with a small pad in his hand, attempting to take control. "We must call the police. Someone must send word at once." Captain Fenwick straightened, taking the initiative. "I'll ride into the village, telephone box near the post office." Miss Marple observed him quietly. The rush to act, the immediate desire to be seen doing something, often revealed more than mere courage. It could be nerves, or it could be the faint shadow of guilt. Sylvia Henshaw, who had followed the hall from the Fete Green, moved to Miss Marple's side. "Do you think—" she began, faltering. "Do I think it was more than a collapse?" Miss Marple supplied gently. "I'm not certain, yet the circumstances demand attention." Eleanor Ware stepped forward, her voice steady and clipped. "We must leave everything as it was. No one touches anything until the authorities arrive." Dr. Ware nodded at his sister. "Quite right." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the tea table. The fallen cup of Mrs. Trent lay shattered, pieces scattered across the rug. The small spoon had been returned, though the sugar bowl remained tilted untouched in its spillage. "Curious," she murmured. Sylvia Henshaw tilted her head. "Curious what?" "The timing of certain objects," Miss Marple said. "One does not notice at first. It is only later that one realises what has shifted and why." Outside, a carriage arrived, the clatter of horses' hooves on stone echoing through the hall. Inspector Thomas Garland stepped out, removing his hat and giving the scene a measured glance. "Dr. Ware?" he inquired. "Gone, I'm afraid," Ware replied quietly, voice tight with professional restraint. "She collapsed at the fete." Garland nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. "And this is the gathering of witnesses?" "Yes," said Dr. Ware. "All who were present on the green are inside now." Inspector Garland's gaze fell upon Miss Marple. He inclined his head. "You're Miss Marple, I believe?" "I am," she said calmly. "You were present when the collapse occurred?" "Yes," she confirmed, "and I observed details others may have overlooked." The inspector noted her age and stature, the mild yet penetrating clarity in her eyes. "I suppose you're going to tell me exactly what we missed?" Miss Marple allowed a small smile. "I only tell when the time is right, Inspector, and usually after the proper reflection." Garland glanced over the villagers. "Right. Let's have everyone state their names and positions at the fete." One by one, the villagers complied. The vicar, the parish committee ladies, Captain Fenwick, the Wares, Sylvia Henshaw, Mrs. Pritchard, all answered, names and brief accounts of where they had been. Miss Marple listened silently, noting discrepancies, hesitations and subtle shifts in posture. Captain Fenwick's fingers drummed against his thighs. a rhythm slightly off from natural agitation. Eleanor Ware spoke quickly, almost rehearsed, while Sylvia Henshaw occasionally hesitated, choosing words with care. Dr. Ware remained beside the inspector, professional and reserved, yet Miss Marple caught the subtle pallor creeping into his complexion. The cup, Miss Marple said softly, bringing attention to herself, was handled by several people before it reached Mrs. Trent. Inspector Garland turned to her. Meaning? I do not know yet. But it is worth remembering. A cup is rarely significant in itself, but who touches it, and when, can speak volumes. The inspector made a note. Very well. There was a brief lull. The hum of the fete had vanished. Only the occasional creak of a chair, the shuffle of feet, and the whispered conversations remained. Miss Marple took the opportunity to study the room in detail. She noticed a smudge on the hem of Eleanor Ware's dress, a slight tremor in Sylvia Henshaw's hands, a patch of dirt on Captain Fenwick's boot that did not match the hall's polished floor. Each seemed trivial, isolated, yet she stored them carefully in her mind. Dr. Ware approached her quietly. Miss Marple, he said, lowering his voice, I must insist you do not draw conclusions in front of the others. I am not, she said, smiling faintly, merely observing. Observation rarely misleads. He hesitated. I hope you're correct. The inspector finally called for order. We will wait for a proper examination, but for now, no one leaves. It is vital that we maintain the scene as it was. The villagers obeyed, a mixture of resignation and unease settling over them. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, sipped what remained in her cup. Her mind turned over the events on the fete green. The collapse, the missing spoon, the minor gestures, the faint reactions. Nothing was yet conclusive. Yet in her experience, the first impression often contained the seed of truth, carefully buried, easily missed, waiting for the right moment to surface. Outside, the afternoon sunlight had begun to slant, gilding the broken petals and the footprints in the grass. Miss Marple's attention returned to Eleanor Ware, who watched the hall door with a stillness that seemed deliberate. Miss Marple did not move toward her. She only watched, her thoughts gathering silently, like the distant approach of a storm. Something had begun at the fete, and it was far from over. She noted quietly to herself that the village of Wych Elm would never be quite the same again. Beneath the veneer of civility, the first tremors of suspicion, fear, and secrecy were already stirring. And in the midst of it, the truth waited, hidden in gestures, objects, and words spoken too softly to be noticed by all but the most patient observer. The church hall, now transformed from festive cheer to quiet tension, carried a scent of damp flowers and polished wood. Miss Marple moved among the remaining villagers with careful deliberation, her eyes catching each small detail that the others overlooked. Inspector Garland had established a cordon around the hall, ensuring no one tampered with the scene. Yet the natural disorder of people in shock could not be restrained entirely. A teacup rattled once on a side table. Mrs. Pritchard muttered under her breath. Captain Fenwick leaned against a wall, restless and impatient. Eleanor Ware remained in the same corner, her back rigid, gloved hands folded precisely before her. Is there any indication of foul play? The vicar asked timidly. Dr. Ware shook his head. At present it could be natural, but the circumstances are unusual. Miss Marple made no comment. She had learned long ago that speculation rarely advanced understanding. Instead, she observed the slight tremor in Captain Fenwick's jaw, the way Eleanor Ware's eyes darted to each new arrival, the subtle hesitation in Sylvia Henshaw's voice when questioned. All of it mattered. The inspector moved closer to Dr. Ware. You say the collapse was sudden? Very, Ware replied. No prior warning beyond minor fatigue which anyone could have noticed. Nothing alarming until this afternoon, Garland nodded. We'll need a post-mortem. In the meantime, statements from witnesses are crucial. Miss Marple watched as the villagers were grouped and questioned. One by one they recounted their movements, their conversations, their fleeting interactions with Mrs. Trent. Most were straightforward, almost rehearsed, yet a few hesitations betrayed more than words ever could. Captain Fenwick recounted the moments at the tea tent with the faint edge of defensiveness. I was serving tea at the far end when she took her cup. I was not near enough to notice anything unusual. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on his hands resting lightly against his knees. The left one bore a tiny smudge of dark residue. Perhaps it was commonplace dirt. Perhaps it was not. Eleanor Ware spoke next. Her voice was calm, even clipped, as though she had prepared her account meticulously. I stood beside my brother, assisting with the judging of the preserves. I did not touch Mrs. Trent or her cup. "And you, Miss Henshaw?" Garland asked. "I was arranging the children's corner," she said. "I did not approach Mrs. Trent during the tea service. I was several feet away at all times." Miss Marple listened, silent, storing the subtleties of tone, rhythm and hesitation. A small movement drew her attention. The jar of damson jelly, knocked earlier to the floor, remained near Eleanor Ware's feet. She had replaced it, yes, but it was slightly crooked. An insignificant detail, but Miss Marple noted it. Dr. Ware approached the inspector. "I would request that no one leaves until the post-mortem is conducted. Mrs. Trent was a patient woman, but her habits and routines may reveal the answer." Garland made a note. Understood. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, felt the weight of observation settle firmly upon her shoulders. Every person present carried traces of motive, opportunity, or anxiety. The difficulty was discerning which combination mattered. Outside, the village remained unaware of the tragedy unfolding within the hall. Children's laughter drifted faintly from the green. A breeze lifted the bunting overhead, brushing the petals of flowers that had been hastily rearranged. The contrast between normality and calamity only sharpened the intensity inside. Mrs. Pritchard leaned toward Miss Marple. "It's dreadful," she whispered. "One cannot believe it. So sudden." "Yes," said Miss Marple, her eyes calm and observant. "And yet one must, for the impossible often cloaks itself in the ordinary. One notices the ordinary only after the impossible has occurred." Mrs. Pritchard frowned, uncertain. "Do you think it could have been intentional?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Perhaps, but intentions are most often revealed not by grand gestures, but by small acts, slight hesitations, brief movements, the manner in which people handle objects." A ripple of sound interrupted them, the footfalls of Dr. Ware moving quickly toward the rear of the hall. He stopped at a table where the broken teacup had been gathered into a small pile. Miss Marple noted the pieces carefully, one fragment stained along its rim, a small chip on the handle, slightly smudged silver. Inspector Garland approached. "Miss Marple, you have been observing carefully. Anything worth noting?" She gestured subtly toward the table. "Notice the arrangement here. One spoon returned to the tray, a sugar bowl slightly tipped, a cup broken in a manner suggesting haste, perhaps nervousness." Garland glanced, eyebrows raised. "You think it matters?" "I think everything matters until proven otherwise," she replied calmly. Captain Fenwick's impatience began to show. He stepped forward. "We cannot stand here all day. If this is natural, we delay the inevitable." Miss Marple's gaze met his. "If it is natural, Captain, one moment is as good as another. If it is not, haste may conceal what patience would reveal." He looked away, irritation flashing briefly. A new figure entered, the village postmaster, flushed from riding. "Inspector Garland, telegram just arrived. The coroner will attend by mid-morning." Garland nodded. "Thank you. That will allow us time for careful examination. Everyone must remain in the hall until then." Miss Marple turned slightly, observing the subtle interactions around her. Eleanor Ware had begun to pace the back, slow and deliberate. Sylvia Henshaw checked the children's corner, adjusting objects almost obsessively. Captain Fenwick stared at the floor, tapping one boot, while Mrs. Pritchard whispered endlessly to anyone who would listen. Dr. Ware returned to her side, voice low. "Miss Marple, it is only courtesy to warn you. The evening promises long waiting. Many questions will arise, some uncomfortable." "I am accustomed to both," she said lightly, "and long waiting often clarifies what sudden movement obscures." The afternoon shadows stretched across the hall. Outside, the green seemed untouched by misfortune, yet inside, every gesture, every glance, and every small act had shifted. The collapse, the missing spoon, the returning objects, all were pieces of a puzzle that only patience and observation could complete. Miss Marple folded her hands. She would not speak out of turn. The inspector and Dr. Ware would conduct the official inquiries. Yet she noted each detail, storing them carefully in her mind. One small slip, one gesture misread, one word spoken too quickly might reveal the truth, and in the village of Witch Elm, secrets she knew rarely remained buried for long. For the first time that afternoon she allowed herself a small thought. The mystery had only just begun. The village hall, stripped of its earlier gaiety, had settled into a tense quiet. Chairs were still askew, a small puddle of tea darkening the rug beneath the broken cup, and the faint scent of crushed flowers lingered in the air. Miss Marple walked slowly along the perimeter, her hands folded, eyes quietly noting every subtle movement. The villagers, still seated or standing in small clusters, whispered among themselves. Captain Fenwick, seated stiffly by the far wall, tapped his boot against the polished floor. His eyes darted repeatedly toward the doorway, as though imagining Mrs. Trent's sudden return. Eleanor Ware remained at the back, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the scattered teacups on the nearest table. Her fingers flexed and relaxed in a controlled rhythm that betrayed neither panic nor grief but a constant inward attention to detail. Sylvia Henshaw, meanwhile, moved with careful precision, picking up small disturbances, the slight tilt of a sugar bowl, the irregular placement of a teacup, returning each to what she perceived as order, though in truth she could not restore what had already occurred. Miss Marple approached her. "A careful hand, Miss Henshaw." Sylvia's eyes met hers briefly, faintly surprised. "I suppose habits remain even under strain," she replied softly. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, sometimes habits speak more truth than words." The inspector had moved closer to Dr. Ware. "We'll need to take individual statements, nothing too rushed, but every detail, where people stood, what they touched, and when." Dr. Ware nodded. "Yes, and a careful review of the events leading to the collapse. It is prudent to consider every possibility, however unlikely it may seem." Miss Marple's gaze swept the hall. One fragment of broken porcelain had caught her attention. A tiny chip, stained slightly at the rim, lying as if deliberately left in view. She remembered Eleanor Ware's careful hands, Captain Fenwick's restless tapping, and Sylvia Henshaw's obsessive adjustments. There were patterns here, subtle but discernible. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Marple, would you mind coming with me?" It was Dr. Ware. He led her to a quiet corner near the side door, away from the cluster of villagers. "I do not wish to alarm you unnecessarily," he began, voice low, "but certain details have emerged that are troubling." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Go on." He hesitated. The cup she drank from. It was examined briefly. There was nothing immediately suspicious, but in light of the collapse, I wonder if there was something unusual in her drink. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Unusual? You mean medically?" "Possibly. I cannot say without proper examination, yet some symptoms suggest an external factor, rather than a simple cardiac failure." She considered this quietly, aware that her expression revealed nothing. "External, you say, not inherent weakness." "That is correct. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to cause collapse without warning." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the tea table. The missing spoon, now returned, glimmered faintly in the afternoon light. The sugar bowl remained tipped, though Sylvia Henshaw had straightened most of the other items. The small fragment of porcelain lay untouched, though she had already considered it more than once. "Who served the tea?" she asked quietly. Captain Fenwick, Dr. Ware, Sylvia, and a young girl from the parish committee all handled cups at some point. Though Fenwick had been distracted, Sylvia occupied with the children, and Dr. Ware's attention elsewhere. The girl, small, quiet, easily overlooked, had moved between trays with care, observing faces rather than handling each cup deliberately. "Attention," Miss Marple said softly. "Notice who touches objects, even briefly. Small actions leave traces that often reveal intent. Objects remember what words do not." Dr. Ware inclined his head. "I trust your meaning, Miss Marple. It is as you have often observed. The simplest gestures can betray a great deal." The inspector returned, clipboard in hand. "We will take statements now. Let's start with those closest to the scene." Captain Fenwick rose reluctantly. "I've given my account." "Yes," Garland said, "but we may need clarification. Wait here." Eleanor Ware moved forward next. Her hands remained clasped, fingers flexing lightly, her expression as controlled as ever. She gave a concise account of her movements, noting where she had been during the tea service, when she approached Mrs. Trent, and how she had interacted with others. Yet one detail, fleeting and almost unnoticed, gave Miss Marple pause. Eleanor had glanced toward the sugar bowl when mentioning Mrs. Trent's last sip. Sylvia Henshaw spoke next. Her account was precise, almost rehearsed, yet Miss Marple detected slight tremors in her voice when referencing the moment Mrs. Trent took the cup. There was more than caution here, perhaps anticipation, perhaps guilt, or perhaps fear. Mrs. Pritchard, eager to be of importance, added her recollection. She emphasized Mrs. Trent's graciousness and energy, while simultaneously hinting at minor tensions among the villagers. Miss Marple noted the subtle contradictions. Mrs. Trent was both vigorous and unwell, ordinary yet unusually attentive to certain people. The vicar offered his account last. He had been observing, trying to maintain calm, yet each statement revealed small uncertainties, hesitations about who handled what, slight exaggerations of distances, and moments of misremembered timing. Miss Marple took a slow breath. So many accounts, so many small discrepancies. Each individual story was plausible, yet taken together, the inconsistencies formed patterns. Inspector Garland finally turned to her. "Miss Marple, I trust you've been making notes. Anything you wish to share?" She shook her head lightly. "Not yet, Inspector. It is often best to wait until more details have emerged. Observation rarely demands immediate judgment." Garland frowned, though with a measure of respect. "Very well, but I hope you'll speak if you notice anything significant." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I shall, when the time is right." The hall was quiet again, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the faint ticking of a distant clock. Shadows had begun to lengthen along the walls. Outside, the faint green appeared undisturbed, as if nothing had occurred. Yet inside, the subtle tension persisted, and Miss Marple knew it would only deepen. She walked slowly past the tea table once more. The small chip of porcelain, the faintly smudged spoon, the tilted sugar bowl, they spoke quietly to her. And in the muted exchanges, the subtle glances and the slight tremors of posture, she began to sense that someone had acted deliberately, though who and why remained hidden. In which elm, she reflected, the ordinary often concealed the extraordinary, and this afternoon, beneath the veneer of calm, the extraordinary had already taken root. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet thought. The mystery had only begun to show its first hints of shape, and patience, as always, would reveal more than haste ever could. Evening had begun to settle over Wych Elm, painting the church hall in a soft glow from the late sun filtering through tall windows. Shadows stretched long across the floor, flickering across overturned chairs and the remnants of a once orderly tea service. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, a mixture of apprehension and polite restraint. Miss Marple stood near the tea table, silent as ever, eyes following the subtle movements of the villagers. Captain Fenwick had retreated to a corner, attempting to control his restlessness, but his leg bounced imperceptibly beneath him. Eleanor Ware had moved closer to the centre of the hall, her posture taut yet controlled, as if she were measuring every breath and gesture around her. Sylvia Henshaw had returned to the children's corner, checking and adjusting the placement of books and toys with meticulous care. Doctor. Julian Ware moved among the crowd, quietly directing questions and offering reassurances. He spoke to the vicar and the parish committee ladies in low tones, leaving the inspector to handle the formal statements. Miss Marple, however, paid close attention to details that others either overlooked or assumed irrelevant. The broken cup on the floor, a tiny fragment stained faintly at the rim, seemed more significant than its mere presence suggested. The spoon that had been returned lay near it, polished but slightly out of alignment. "Everything seems so ordinary," Sylvia Henshaw murmured, approaching Miss Marple once more. "And yet, it does not feel right." "Ordinary is a cloak," Miss Marple replied softly. "It hides what we do not wish to see. Sometimes the smallest gestures, how someone handles a cup, a glance, a tremor, reveal more than a confession ever could." Sylvia nodded, clearly troubled but attentive. The inspector's voice rose, calling the villagers to a collective attention. "We will now take individual accounts in detail. I must ask everyone to remain patient and precise. Every detail matters." Captain Fenwick stood first, his composure brittle under close scrutiny. He recounted the moments before Mrs. Trent's collapse, emphasising the distance he had maintained from her, his duties with the tea service, and the distraction caused by the spilled cups. Yet Miss Marple noted a subtle inconsistency in his narrative. He mentioned lifting the tray with one hand, but she had observed the smudge on his left hand slightly darkened, perhaps residue of something he had handled before the collapse. Eleanor Ware followed. She delivered her account with the precise articulation one might expect from a trained observer, yet Miss Marple's sharp eye caught the slight tension in her jaw when she mentioned assisting her brother with the preserves. There was no overt anxiety, only a quiet rigidity, which, as Miss Marple knew, could conceal a great deal. Sylvia Henshaw gave her statement next, measured and deliberate. She recounted supervising the children's activities, attending to small details, and remaining physically distant from Mrs. Trent. Her calm voice carried a subtle tremor when mentioning Mrs. Trent's sip of tea, as if recalling something she could not entirely account for herself. Mrs. Pritchard's narrative was longer, imbued with the eagerness of someone determined to be noticed. She emphasised Mrs. Trent's grace, energy, and oversight, but also hinted at tensions among the villagers, especially between Captain Fenwick and Eleanor Ware. Miss Marple noted the contradictions carefully. Mrs. Trent appeared both vigorous and faintly ill, authoritative yet responsive to subtle pressures. The vicar, Reverend Simon Bell, presented his account last. He had observed most of the proceedings and had tried to maintain calm. Yet the way he recounted distances and movements, hesitating at certain points, overestimating or underestimating minor interactions, suggested uncertainty. Miss Marple filed each hesitation in her mind. Dr. Ware rejoined her quietly, leaning slightly so only she could hear. "Miss Marple, you have been observing all this. What is your impression?" She shook her head faintly. "Too soon to say, Julian. Observation can only gather facts, not conclusions. But the pattern is forming, and one must wait until it is sufficiently complete before drawing inferences." Outside, the sunset cast a deep gold across the green, gilding the overturned bunting and the distant line of cottages. The contrast between the tranquil village outside and the charged atmosphere within the hall was stark. It reminded Miss Marple that appearances were often misleading, and the ordinary could conceal extraordinary motives. The inspector, sensing the lengthening day, called for a brief recess. "We will pause for refreshments and allow some distance before continuing with more detailed questioning." The villagers dispersed slightly, some moving to the hall's outer rooms, others remaining near the tea table. Captain Fenwick returned to his corner, still restless. Eleanor Ware walked along the back, eyes darting subtly to the table. Sylvia Henshaw lingered near Miss Marple, whispering, "Do you think—" "Patience," Miss Marple replied. "The truth often hides in small details, revealed only when one watches long enough." The conversation drew to a halt as Dr. Ware returned from the vestry room. He approached the inspector and spoke in low tones, then glanced at Miss Marple. "They are ready for you," he said. "The small items, the cup and the spoon, you may wish to inspect them carefully." Miss Marple's eyes lit briefly. She approached the table with deliberate steps, noting the faint stain on the cup, the alignment of the spoon, and the slight tilt of the sugar bowl. Each tiny irregularity spoke quietly to her, suggesting movement, hesitation, or intentional placement. She noticed Eleanor Ware observing her from a distance. Posture rigid, hands clasped in front. Captain Fenwick too was watching, boot tapping softly against the floor, and Sylvia Henshaw, near enough to overhear, appeared to follow her every gesture, curiosity mingled with unease. Miss Marple crouched slightly, examining the cup fragment. The faint discoloration seemed almost theatrical in its subtlety. It could have been accidental, of course. Yet in her experience, nothing was ever entirely accidental when human intention was involved. Dr. Ware leaned close. "Do you suspect—" "I suspect only that the truth will reveal itself," Miss Marple replied quietly. "But it will not do so in a hurry. Those who act deliberately are careful, and one must be equally patient to see them stumble." The hall fell quiet once more. Shadows deepened. Outside, the first stars began to appear in the sky. Inside, the villagers waited, restless and tense. Small gestures, the way someone adjusted a glove, the angle of a gaze, a faint twitch of a hand, carried more meaning than words. Miss Marple stood, letting her eyes drift over each figure. In Wych Elm, ordinary people had suddenly become the custodians of extraordinary secrets. The collapse at the fete was no longer a mere accident in her mind. It was an event loaded with questions, and somewhere among the villagers the answer lay hidden. She allowed herself a quiet thought. Patience and observation would reveal it, and when the truth emerged it would be subtle, unexpected, and inevitable. Night had settled over Wych Elm, draping the village in soft silver light. From the church hall, shadows fell across the polished wooden floor, distorting the edges of chairs and the scattered debris of the afternoon fete. Miss Marple remained near the tea table, her posture calm, hands folded, eyes alert to every subtle movement around her. Captain Fenwick had grown more restless as the evening progressed. He prowled near the back of the hall, boot tapping lightly against the floor, his face a study in taut impatience. Eleanor Ware lingered at the far corner, gloved hands folded neatly, eyes flicking occasionally to the table as if measuring every minor imperfection. Sylvia Henshaw, in contrast, hovered near the children's corner, straightening toys and adjusting books with precise care, yet her glances toward the main table were frequent and uneasy. Dr. Ware moved among the group with quiet authority, whispering instructions to the vicar and parish committee ladies, ensuring that the scene remained undisturbed. Inspector Garland was busy reviewing his notes and checking statements, his brow furrowed with concentration. Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn to smaller, quieter details. A faint smudge on Captain Fenwick's cuff caught her eye, a dark mark barely noticeable, yet slightly out of place on his otherwise polished attire. Eleanor Ware's rigid posture seemed almost deliberate, a contrast to the fluid motions of Sylvia Henshaw, adjusting items near the children's corner, and the broken teacup on the floor, with its tiny stained fragment, spoke volumes when considered alongside the misplaced spoon and tilted sugar bowl. "You're still observing," Sylvia Henshaw said softly, coming to Miss Marple's side. "I am," Miss Marple replied, her voice quiet. "Observation rarely deceives. Though it may take time for the full meaning to emerge, one must wait for the right moment." Sylvia glanced toward the table. "Do you think someone acted deliberately?" Miss Marple gave a faint, thoughtful smile. "It is possible, though nothing is certain yet. Even the smallest gestures can conceal intention." The inspector called the group together. "We're now going to review each person's movements in more detail. Please be patient and precise. Every action, every glance, every minor gesture could be important." Captain Fenwick rose first, standing stiffly. He recounted the moments before Mrs. Trent's collapse, emphasizing that he had maintained distance while assisting with the tea. Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation in his speech when he mentioned handling the tray, and the faint smudge on his cuff reinforced her curiosity. Eleanor Ware followed, delivering her account with the precise articulation of someone trained in observation. She described assisting her brother, supervising the judging of the preserves, and remaining careful in her movements. Yet Miss Marple's keen eye caught the momentary tension around her jaw and the subtle glance toward the sugar bowl when she mentioned Mrs. Trent's last sip. Sylvia Henshaw gave her account next, speaking softly but deliberately. Her story was composed, yet a slight tremor in her voice surfaced when she referenced the exact moment Mrs. Trent took her tea. Miss Marple filed that observation carefully. The tremor suggested apprehension, whether fear or knowledge of something others had overlooked. Mrs. Pritchard's narrative followed, eager and detailed, emphasizing Mrs. Trent's grace and energy, while hinting at underlying tensions among the villagers. Miss Marple noticed the contradictions. Mrs. Trent was vigorous, yet faintly unwell, authoritative, yet responsive to subtle pressures. Finally, Reverend Bell provided his account. Observant but nervous, he recounted his observations and attempts to maintain calm. His hesitations regarding who touched what, slight misremembering of distances, and minor inconsistencies were all carefully noted by Miss Marple. Dr. Ware returned to Miss Marple's side. "Your impressions?" he asked quietly. "Too early for conclusions," she replied, "but there is a pattern forming. Haste can obscure truth. Patience reveals it." A soft knock interrupted them. The postmaster had returned with a small envelope. Garland opened it, reading quickly, then handed a copy to Dr. Ware. "The coroner confirms he will attend first thing in the morning. Until then, We keep all as is." The villagers were allowed a brief respite, moving slightly about the hall. Captain Fenwick, still restless, kept glancing toward the tea table. Eleanor Ware remained composed but alert, eyes following small movements. Sylvia Henshaw adjusted minor disruptions, her expression thoughtful and tense. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the tea table. The broken cup, the returned spoon, and the slightly tipped sugar bowl, all were ordinary objects, yet together they spoke of subtle actions. She crouched slightly to examine the fragments more closely. The faint discoloration on the cup seemed almost intentional, though it could also have been accidental. Dr. Ware leaned in. "You suspect something, I presume?" "Not yet," she said gently. "But one cannot ignore what the smallest details reveal." Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet reflection. The collapse was not necessarily accidental. The subtle gestures, slight tremors, and small irregularities formed a web of observation. Somewhere within it, someone had acted, or failed to act, with intention. Outside, the first stars appeared over Wych Elm, shining coldly above the village green. The contrast between the tranquil night and the charged atmosphere in the hall was stark. Miss Marple noted the silent tension, how ordinary routines and gestures were now coloured by suspicion. She observed Captain Fenwick again. The tapping of his boot had ceased, replaced by a subtle fidgeting of the fingers. Eleanor Ware remained in her corner, back straight, hands folded, watching. Sylvia Henshaw moved back to the children's corner, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the main table. Each movement, subtle and deliberate, added to the accumulating pattern of human behaviour. Miss Marple took a deep breath. The hall was quiet. The villagers awaited the coroner, statements had been taken, yet the mystery deepened rather than diminished. The collapse, the missing spoon, the slight inconsistencies, all pointed toward a truth that had yet to fully reveal itself. She allowed herself a quiet thought. In Wych Elm, the ordinary concealed the extraordinary, and when the truth emerged, it would be subtle, unexpected, and inevitable. Miss Marple folded her hands, eyes sweeping the hall one final time. Patience, she reminded herself. Observation would uncover what hasty investigation might overlook, and in a village such as this, where manners often mask deeper intentions, the smallest gestures frequently carried the weight of revelation. For the first time that night, she allowed herself a small, private smile. The web of the village's secrets had begun to show the faintest glimmer of pattern, and she would unravel it in due course. The following morning, Wych Elm awoke to a quiet that was anything but ordinary. Birds called tentatively from the trees along the village green, their song fractured by the subtle tension that lingered over cottages and gardens. The fete green, once a scene of laughter and chatter, now seemed suspended in an uneasy stillness, as if the day itself hesitated to resume normal rhythm. Miss Marple arrived at the church hall just as the coroner, Dr. Langley, was setting up his instruments. The inspector had already organised the villagers, ensuring that no one interfered with the scene. Captain Fenwick leaned against a wall, still tense, while Eleanor Ware remained distant, back straight, hands folded. Sylvia Henshaw adjusted her hat nervously, glancing toward the broken cup and spoon. Dr. Langley moved quickly, speaking in low tones. "We will need to examine the body in detail, but preliminary observations are telling. There is no obvious trauma, no visible sign of struggle. A sudden internal failure is most likely, though I will need a full post-mortem to confirm." Miss Marple, watching, allowed her gaze to drift over the scene. The small details, the broken teacup, the returned spoon, the tipped sugar bowl, remained as silent witnesses. Each seemed innocuous on its own, yet taken together, they formed a pattern that whispered of intention, careful planning, or perhaps a subtle accident designed to appear as natural. Inspector Garland addressed the group. "We will begin statements once the coroner has completed his initial examination. I need precise recollections of the moments leading to the collapse. Every gesture, every glance, every word matters." Captain Fenwick straightened, his impatience evident. "We've already given statements. Surely that should suffice." "Precision matters, Captain," Garland replied, voice firm, "and there are inconsistencies that need clarification." Eleanor Ware stepped slightly forward. "I suppose we must comply," she said, voice calm but with a hidden tension. Sylvia Henshaw moved closer to Miss Marple. "Do you think the coroner will confirm anything unusual?" Miss Marple shook her head slightly. It is too early to say. Yet the smallest details often provide the first true hints, even before a formal examination begins. Dr. Ware approached, voice low. "Miss Marple, you may wish to examine the table and surroundings while the coroner works. Subtle things, objects, placement, small irregularities can reveal much." Miss Marple inclined her head. She moved to the tea table, noting the minor disturbances with meticulous care. The broken cup lay as it had the night before, a faint stain along its rim. The spoon, returned to its place, was ever so slightly askew. The sugar bowl remained tilted, and a fragment of fallen flour rested nearby. She crouched, examining the items carefully. The fragment of porcelain, the tiny stain, and the slight displacement of utensils, ordinary in isolation, but together suggesting a series of deliberate, controlled movements. From the corner, Captain Fenwick's voice rose sharply. "I do not see what all this fuss is about. She took tea, collapsed. Perhaps it was merely her heart." Miss Marple's gaze flicked to him. "Captain Fenwick," she said softly, "the heart rarely acts alone. Often it is influenced by external factors, subtle pressures, or small changes unnoticed by most." He flushed, eyes darting toward Eleanor Ware, who had not moved but for a slight tightening of her gloved hands. Sylvia Henshaw shifted her weight from one foot to the other, a faint tremor betraying her otherwise composed expression. The coroner meanwhile moved over Mrs. Trent's body, noting posture, hand placement and minor external features. Dr. Ware observed closely, standing just behind him, offering small pieces of information quietly to Garland and Miss Marple. Miss Marple, crouching near the table again, noticed a faint smudge on the edge of the tray. Subtle, nearly invisible, but telling. It suggested someone had handled the cup with care, or perhaps with hesitation. She straightened slowly, letting her eyes drift over the assembled villagers. Dr. Ware whispered, "It is remarkable how quickly appearances can mislead. One might think the event accidental, yet every gesture carries potential meaning." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, and every person here, however composed, has left traces of their involvement. Not necessarily culpable, but revealing nonetheless." Inspector Garland called the group together once more. "We will review movements in greater detail. I want exact accounts of where each person was, what they were doing, and who they observed." Captain Fenwick shifted uneasily. "Again?" "I've told you everything," Eleanor Ware responded softly, voice even. "We will cooperate. Precision is important." Sylvia Henshaw followed, reporting her position near the children's corner, her duties, and the moments when she looked toward Mrs. Trent. Mrs. Pritchard added her observations, emphasizing the minor interactions she had noted during the tea service. Miss Marple's attention focused on Eleanor Ware again. The tilt of her head, the controlled movements of her hands, and the occasional glance toward the cup and spoon were all carefully recorded in her mind. Something about those gestures spoke of deliberate observation, perhaps worry, or a subtle awareness of what others had done. Captain Fenwick, growing restless, drummed his fingers on a table edge. Miss Marple noted a faint smudge on one hand. The slight twitch in his posture, the impatient movements that contrasted sharply with Eleanor's calm rigidity and Sylvia's careful precision. The inspector and Dr. Ware moved to the centre of the hall, conferring quietly. Miss Marple allowed herself a brief smile. Small details, gestures and reactions often revealed more than the most carefully prepared statements. The afternoon light grew stronger, filtering through the hall windows, casting long shifting shadows. Miss Marple observed them silently, noting how the shadows fell over the broken cup, the spoon and the sugar bowl. Everything spoke to her, and the pattern was beginning to take form in her mind. A sudden hush fell over the hall as the coroner concluded his preliminary examination. "There is nothing obvious externally," Dr. Langley said. "Internal cause is most likely, though I must conduct a full post-mortem to be certain. In the meantime, no one may touch anything." Miss Marple straightened, letting her gaze sweep the hall once more. Every gesture, glance and tremor had been recorded, and every subtle displacement of objects noted. The village of Wych Elm, she reflected, had concealed a truth beneath its ordinary surface, and slowly, carefully, she would uncover it. Patience and observation, she reminded herself. That would reveal more than speculation or panic. And in a village such as this, where manners masked intentions, the smallest slip often carried the weight of revelation. By mid-morning, the village hall had taken on the stillness of a place temporarily frozen in time. Outside, the sun glinted off the church spire, illuminating the tidy cottages and the green that had hosted the fete just a day before. Inside, Wych Elm's villagers moved quietly, hesitant as though careful footsteps could prevent the memory of yesterday's collapse from lingering in the air. Miss Marple remained close to the tea table, her hands folded, eyes quietly tracking every subtle motion. Eleanor Ware sat near the back, hands clasped, eyes alert, but carefully restrained. Captain Fenwick, who had initially prowled the corners like a caged animal, now rested against a wall, tapping a boot against the floor in quiet impatience. Sylvia Henshaw lingered near the children's corner, occasionally straightening toys and books, yet her glances toward the main table were frequent, anxious. Inspector Garland, clipboard in hand, had organised the villagers into groups to provide more detailed recollections of movements, gestures, and positions at the time of Mrs. Trent's collapse. Dr. Langley, the coroner, was preparing his notes for the upcoming post-mortem, consulting briefly with Dr. Ware. Miss Marple's attention returned to the small fragments on the table, the broken cup, the spoon returned with a slight tilt, the sugar bowl tipped just enough to suggest disturbance. Each minor detail, taken alone, might seem trivial. Together they formed a subtle pattern of action and reaction, hinting at the delicate interplay of intent and oversight. "Miss Marple," Sylvia Henshaw whispered, stepping close, "do you think there's something more?" Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Perhaps, but one must be patient. The smallest actions, the briefest gestures, often reveal the greatest truths when observed closely." The inspector called forward Captain Fenwick once more. "I need precise information on the moments immediately preceding Mrs. Trent's collapse. Where were you? What did you handle? And who did you notice?" Fenwick's jaw tightened. "I've told you everything. I was assisting at the tea table, keeping my distance. I noticed nothing unusual, certainly nothing to explain her sudden collapse." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him. The slight smudge on his left cuff, nearly imperceptible, caught her attention again. She did not speak but stored it carefully, aware that such minor traces often revealed what words concealed. Eleanor Ware followed. Her account was meticulous and controlled, detailing each moment she spent assisting her brother with the judging of preserves and monitoring the tea service. Yet Miss Marple observed the brief, almost imperceptible flick of her eyes toward the tea table when she mentioned Mrs. Trent's sip. Small gestures, in her experience, were far more revealing than prepared narratives. Sylvia Henshaw gave her statement next. Her voice remained measured and precise, yet a subtle tremor emerged when she described the moment Mrs. Trent raised the cup to her lips. Miss Marple noted it carefully. The tremor suggested apprehension, awareness, or unease, and it was significant precisely because it was fleeting. Mrs. Pritchard, eager to be noticed, added her recollections. She emphasized Mrs. Trent's elegance and energy while subtly hinting at tensions among the villagers. Miss Marple catalogued each minor contradiction. Mrs. Trent appeared vigorous yet faintly unwell, commanding yet responsive to slight pressures from her acquaintances. Finally, the vicar, Reverend Bell, gave his account. Observant but cautious, he relayed his attempts to maintain calm, noting minor hesitations regarding who handled what and when. Miss Marple filed these observations, knowing that even small misrememberings could hold vital clues. Dr. Ware approached her quietly. "Miss Marple, the patterns you observe, do they suggest anything specific?" She shook her head slightly. "Not yet, Julian. Observation alone gathers data, not conclusions, but patterns are emerging. Haste obscures truth. Patience illuminates it." A faint creak from the side door announced the arrival of the postmaster. He handed Inspector Garland a small envelope. Garland opened it, reading the contents, and then passed a copy to Dr. Ware. "The coroner will attend shortly. In the meantime, nothing must be touched." Miss Marple's gaze swept over the villagers. Each subtle movement, the tap of a boot, the shift of weight, the faint tremor of a gloved hand, was recorded quietly in her mind. Ordinary gestures, isolated, might appear insignificant. Taken together, they spoke of awareness, intention, or fear. Captain Fenwick, growing restless, paced a few steps. He paused at the edge of the table, eyes lingering on the broken cup. The faint smudge on his cuff caught her attention again. Eleanor Ware, meanwhile, adjusted a glove subtly, a calculated motion, her posture rigid but attentive. Sylvia Henshaw straightened a book at the children's corner, fingers lingering for a second longer than necessary on the spine. Miss Marple crouched slightly near the table, studying the fragments closely. The faint stain on the rim, the slightly misaligned spoon, the tilt of the sugar bowl, they all suggested movement with purpose, or at the very least movement that mattered. Dr. Ware whispered beside her, "Do you suspect deliberate action?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps the small actions merely reveal the character of those present. One must wait for the full picture before knowing." Inspector Garland called the group together again. "We will review movements once more, but this time I need exact accounts of any unusual actions, however minor they may seem." Captain Fenwick's irritation was evident. "Unusual actions? I was merely serving tea and assisting where needed," Eleanor Ware replied softly. "We will comply, Captain. Precision is paramount." Sylvia Henshaw recounted her movements once more, emphasizing her distance from Mrs. Trent and her attention to the children. Mrs. Pritchard added minor details she had previously omitted, hoping to be helpful. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Eleanor Ware, whose posture and gestures remained disciplined yet subtly revealing. Each glance, each small adjustment seemed deliberate, as if carefully monitoring the scene. Captain Fenwick's restless movements contrasted sharply with Eleanor's stillness, and Sylvia's meticulous care added another layer to the tableau. The hall fell quiet as Dr. Langley completed his preliminary examination. "Nothing obvious externally," he said. "Internal cause seems most likely, though I will conduct a full post-mortem shortly. No one may touch anything until then." Miss Marple straightened and allowed her gaze to sweep the hall once more. She catalogued every subtle gesture, every slight movement, every minor irregularity. The ordinary had already revealed extraordinary truths, and she was certain the next steps would bring more clarity. Patience, observation, and quiet attention would uncover the answer. And in which elm, beneath the polite veneer of the villagers, the subtle threads of motive and intent were beginning to reveal themselves. Miss Marple's mind worked calmly, recording everything, ready to follow the faintest trace of truth wherever it might lead. The post-mortem had been scheduled for the morning, yet the hall remained charged with quiet tension. The villagers gathered again, subdued, the initial shock of Mrs. Trent's collapse now settling into a lingering unease. Even the sunlight streaming through the tall windows seemed filtered by the weight of yesterday's events, casting elongated shadows across the polished floor. Miss Marple remained near the tea table, cataloguing every detail as though the broken cup and returned spoon held the key to understanding human nature itself. Captain Fenwick had taken a corner by the far wall, boots tapping lightly against the floor, eyes shifting continually, restless. Eleanor Ware had moved closer to the table, hands folded with rigid precision, occasionally flicking glances at the minor irregularities, the spoon, the sugar bowl, the small fragment of porcelain. Sylvia Henshaw hovered near the children's corner, adjusting books and toys but repeatedly glancing toward the main table, a subtle tension betraying her otherwise composed demeanour. Inspector Garland had gathered the group near the centre of the hall. "We will proceed with more detailed questioning. It is crucial that everyone recounts their exact movements, any observations and interactions during the tea service. Every detail, however minor, may be significant." Captain Fenwick stepped forward first. His voice was steady but carried a subtle edge of impatience. "I've told you everything. I served tea, helped where needed, and was nowhere near anything unusual." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, noting the faint smudge on his cuff and the tension in his shoulders. Small traces, she thought, often revealed far more than words. Eleanor Ware spoke next. Her account was precise, measured, almost rehearsed. She detailed assisting her brother with the preserves, her position at the table, and the brief interactions she had with Mrs. Trent. Yet her eyes flickered momentarily toward the broken cup when she mentioned the final sip. Miss Marple noted this subtle movement carefully. It suggested a consciousness of the cup that she could not yet explain. Sylvia Henshaw's statement followed. She described supervising the children's corner, remaining distant from Mrs. Trent, and attending to minor disruptions. Her voice trembled faintly when referencing the exact moment of the collapse, an imperceptible quiver that could indicate fear, anxiety, or perhaps hidden knowledge. Mrs. Pritchard added her observations, eager to be helpful, emphasising Mrs. Trent's elegance and energy while subtly hinting at tensions among the villagers. Miss Marple catalogued each minor contradiction. Mrs. Trent had been vigorous yet faintly unwell, commanding yet responsive to subtle pressures from those around her. Reverend Bell provided his account last. His statements were careful, measured, yet contained slight uncertainties, hesitations about who touched what, minor misrememberings and subtle inconsistencies. These he offered with earnestness, unaware that his minor discrepancies were significant in the web Miss Marple was quietly constructing. Dr. Ware leaned toward Miss Marple. "Patterns are emerging, are they not?" he whispered. She nodded slightly. "The smallest details often reveal the greatest truths. We must watch and wait. Actions, gestures, and inconsistencies matter far more than declarations." At that moment the postmaster entered, bringing word that the coroner had arrived and was ready to begin the examination. Inspector Garland gathered the villagers for a brief pause, allowing Miss Marple the chance to inspect the table and surroundings alone. She crouched near the tea table, her eyes tracing the faint discoloration on the cup, the slight misalignment of the returned spoon, and the tilt of the sugar bowl. Everything seemed ordinary at first glance, yet together they suggested movement, hesitation, or deliberate placement. Eleanor Ware's glances had been precise. Captain Fenwick's impatience carried subtle tells. Sylvia Henshaw's meticulous adjustments betrayed unease. All of these small actions coalesced into a pattern. Dr. Ware approached again. "Do you suspect someone acted deliberately?" Miss Marple considered carefully. "It is not certain. Perhaps the actions reveal intention. Perhaps they reveal character. The pattern is forming, but it is incomplete. Patience is required before conclusions are drawn." Outside, the village green seemed untouched by calamity. The children played in small, quiet clusters, unaware of the investigation unfolding within the hall. The contrast between the calm exterior and the tension inside was stark. Miss Marple observed this quietly. Ordinary appearances often hid extraordinary truths. The coroner began his examination, methodically recording observations. Miss Marple remained nearby, noting every subtle movement of his instruments, every tilt of Mrs. Trent's body, and the way her hands rested now compared with the day of the collapse. Small marks, the position of clothing, and the slight disturbance of the table were all recorded mentally. Inspector Garland consulted his notes, speaking softly with Dr. Ware. Miss Marple observed Captain Fenwick shifting his weight, glancing repeatedly at Eleanor Ware, who in turn watched the scene with disciplined attention. Sylvia Henshaw adjusted the corner again, almost obsessively, but kept her eyes on the tea table. Miss Marple's mind catalogued everything, the gestures, the postures, the faint traces of movement on the table. Ordinary actions, isolated, might appear insignificant. Taken together, they formed a story waiting to be read. Dr. Ware leaned closer. "The coroner's initial observations are inconclusive. There is no external trauma. It may have been sudden internal failure, but even minor anomalies will need careful examination." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Then patience, observation, and careful attention to what others overlook will guide us. The ordinary often contains the extraordinary if one knows where to look." Inspector Garland, noticing her gaze on the table, asked quietly, "Miss Marple, any observations at this point?" She smiled faintly, cryptic as ever. Only that the smallest gestures, the briefest hesitations, and the subtle placement of objects often carry far more meaning than one expects. "We must watch closely. The truth will reveal itself in due course." The hall remained quiet, charged with tension. Each villager's movements, expressions, and minor actions were a note in a larger symphony of human behaviour. Miss Marple catalogued them silently, knowing the pattern was beginning to emerge. Patience, she reminded herself. Observation, combined with a careful eye for the smallest irregularities, would reveal the story hidden beneath polite manners and ordinary appearances. In Wych Elm, the collapse had not been merely a medical event. The subtle interplay of gestures, objects, and reactions hinted at something deeper. Miss Marple understood that the next few hours would be crucial in discerning who acted, who observed, and who concealed the truth. She allowed herself a quiet thought. The extraordinary often hides in plain sight, and in the village of Wych Elm the first true threads of the mystery were now beginning to unravel. The afternoon sun had begun to dip behind the trees lining the village green, casting long shadows through the tall windows of the church hall. Inside, the atmosphere remained heavy, charged with anticipation and the quiet anxiety of the villagers. The coroner's initial examination had concluded, leaving more questions than answers, and Inspector Garland was preparing for a new round of statements, this time with greater scrutiny. Miss Marple observed quietly, standing near the tea table. The broken cup lay in the same position as before, the faint stain along its rim still visible. The returned spoon remained slightly askew and the sugar bowl tilted ever so subtly. These minor irregularities were insignificant to most, but to Miss Marple they were threads in a larger tapestry. Captain Fenwick paced near the far wall, his boot tapping against the polished floor. His hands flexed nervously, then clasped behind his back. Eleanor Ware remained still, gloved hands folded, eyes occasionally flicking toward the table with careful precision. Sylvia Henshaw lingered near the children's corner, adjusting the positions of books and toys, yet her gaze frequently strayed toward the main table, betraying a quiet tension. Inspector Garland called the group together once more. "We will now review each person's movements in even greater detail. Any hesitation, glance, or minor action may be significant. I expect full cooperation." Captain Fenwick stepped forward first. "I've already stated my movements clearly. I assisted with the tea, kept my distance from Mrs. Trent, and observed nothing unusual." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on him. The faint smudge on his left cuff, combined with his restless posture, suggested more than he wished to reveal. She made a mental note, storing it carefully. Eleanor Ware followed. Her account was precise and controlled. She described her movements assisting Dr. Ware, monitoring the preserves, and briefly interacting with Mrs. Trent. Yet Miss Marple noticed the almost imperceptible flick of her eyes toward the broken cup when she mentioned Mrs. Trent's last sip. Small, fleeting gestures often spoke louder than rehearsed words. Sylvia Henshaw gave her statement next. Her voice was calm and measured, but a faint tremor appeared when she described Mrs. Trent raising the cup. Miss Marple catalogued this carefully. It could indicate fear, hesitation, or knowledge of a detail others overlooked. Mrs. Pritchard, eager to be helpful, added her observations. She emphasized Mrs. Trent's energy and grace, while subtly hinting at tensions among the villagers. Miss Marple noted minor contradictions. Mrs. Trent was vigorous yet faintly unwell, commanding yet subtly responsive to pressures around her. Finally, Reverend Bell gave his account. He described his attempts to maintain calm and observe the proceedings, yet slight inconsistencies emerged. Miss Marple recorded the hesitations regarding distances and timing, aware that small errors could be as telling as deliberate actions, Dr. Ware whispered to her. "The patterns you observe, do they suggest anything specific yet?" Miss Marple shook her head lightly. "Not conclusively. Observation gathers facts, but conclusions require a full picture. Patterns are forming, though." Outside, the village green remained deceptively tranquil. Children played quietly, oblivious to the investigations unfolding within the hall. The contrast between the calm exterior and the charged interior reminded Miss Marple how ordinary appearances often concealed extraordinary truths. The coroner returned briefly to consult with Inspector Garland. "Preliminary examination suggests sudden internal failure, but subtle anomalies may yet be uncovered in the full post-mortem. We must preserve all evidence until then." Miss Marple's gaze returned to the table. The small fragment of porcelain, the slightly misaligned spoon, the tipped sugar bowl, all told a story of movement and timing. Each person present had left traces, however subtle. Ordinary gestures, when carefully observed, often revealed far more than statements or assumptions. Captain Fenwick, growing restless, walked closer to the table. He leaned slightly, peering at the fragments with an expression of faint curiosity mixed with impatience. Eleanor Ware's hands flexed again, and her gaze shifted subtly to the same table. Sylvia Henshaw, adjusting a book nearby, glanced toward them both, tension visible in her posture. Miss Marple crouched slightly, studying the fragments carefully. The faint stain on the rim of the cup was not remarkable in itself, but when combined with the spoon and sugar bowl it suggested controlled, deliberate movement. The small smudge on Captain Fenwick's cuff, Eleanor's precise glances, and Sylvia's careful adjustments all added layers to the emerging pattern. Dr. Ware whispered beside her. "Do you believe deliberate action was involved?" Miss Marple considered. "Perhaps, perhaps not. But every gesture, every object, and every glance contributes to the narrative. The pattern is emerging, and soon the smallest details will illuminate what remains hidden." Inspector Garland, noticing her attention to the table, approached. "Miss Marple, any observations at this stage?" She smiled faintly, cryptic as ever. "Only that the smallest gestures, the briefest hesitations, and the subtle placement of objects often carry more meaning than statements alone. We must watch carefully. The truth will emerge in time." The villagers remained quiet, aware that they were being observed, yet unaware of which details mattered most. Captain Fenwick's boot tapped lightly again, Eleanor Ware's posture remained rigid, and Sylvia Henshaw's attention flitted between children and the main table. Miss Marple straightened, allowing her gaze to sweep the hall. Every gesture, glance, and small irregularity had been recorded in her mind. The ordinary objects, the cup, spoon, and sugar bowl, had already revealed hints of intention and awareness. Patience, she reminded herself. Observation and attention to subtle discrepancies would reveal what hasty investigation could not. In Wych Elm, the veneer of civility concealed hidden truths, and for the first time that day, Miss Marple felt the faintest sense of the larger pattern emerging. The web of minor actions, concealed gestures, and fleeting reactions that would eventually expose the hidden motive behind Mrs. Trent's sudden collapse. The truth, she knew, was only beginning to surface. By the early evening, the coroner's full post-mortem had been completed, and Inspector Garland gathered the villagers once more in the church hall. The long day of statements, observations, and careful examination had created a charged quiet. Every face held expectation, anxiety, or curiosity. Miss Marple, calm as ever, stood slightly apart, letting the inspector organise the group. "Everyone," Garland began, "we have completed the necessary preliminary investigations. There remain questions, but I hope to clarify matters with all present. I ask for your full attention." Miss Marple took a quiet step forward, her eyes sweeping the hall. The broken cup on the table, the slightly misaligned spoon, and the tipped sugar bowl had already told a story. Now it was time for the final pieces to fall into place. "Captain Fenwick," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle yet firm, "you were the first to serve the tea that afternoon. You handled many cups, yet one cup, the one Mrs. Trent drank from, had been handled differently." The captain stiffened. "Differently? I don't understand." Miss Marple's eyes softened but did not waver. "The faint smudge on your cuff, Captain, was the result of handling that particular cup while the sugar bowl had already been tipped. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but it indicated that something in your movements was not ordinary." Captain Fenwick shifted uneasily. It was an accident. I spilled nothing, I swear." "Not the spill, Captain," Miss Marple interrupted, "but the hesitation, the careful placement. You were aware of its significance, even if only subconsciously. It revealed something you may not have intended to show." Eleanor Ware's gloved hands tightened as Miss Marple turned toward her. "And you, Miss Ware, observed the cup closely before it reached Mrs. Trent. Your glance at the sugar bowl at that precise moment indicated anticipation. You were alert to what others would not notice, and yet you did not intervene." Eleanor's lips pressed together. I was only careful not to disturb anything. I thought it might upset her." Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "No, you knew more. You were observing for a reason." Sylvia Henshaw's fingers, still lightly adjusting a stack of books at the children's corner, twitched slightly. I only watched. I did not." Miss Marple's gaze softened further. "You observed? Yes. And in observing you noted what Captain Fenwick and Eleanor Ware did not wish to reveal. That observation was crucial, for it showed the awareness of all involved, even if not the intent." The hall grew still. Every villager seemed to lean slightly forward, aware that the web Miss Marple had quietly been untangling was about to be explained. "Mrs. Trent," Miss Marple continued, "was not the victim of a sudden natural failure alone. The tea she drank that afternoon contained a minute quantity of arsenic, enough to cause collapse without immediate overt symptoms. The effect was slow, subtle, designed to appear accidental. Yet the placement of the cup, the hesitation in handling, and the slight misalignments revealed who had acted deliberately. Captain Fenwick's face paled. Arsenic? But I... Exactly, Miss Marple said gently. You did not administer it, Captain. You handled the cup after it had been prepared. The intent was elsewhere. All eyes turned toward Eleanor Ware, whose composure faltered for the first time. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. It was you, she said quietly. You prepared the tea with knowledge of Mrs. Trent's habits and her health, knowing precisely how a small quantity would act. The faint tremors you observed in others were the reaction to what they sensed subconsciously. Captain Fenwick's hesitation, Sylvia Henshaw's adjustments, and even Dr. Ware's silent concern, all of it was consistent with the subtle effects of your deliberate action. Eleanor Ware's gloved hands fell to her sides. I didn't intend to kill her, only to frighten her, to teach her caution. I did not think she would die. Miss Marple nodded. Intent matters, but the result is unavoidable. The poison was measured, calculated and hidden. Yet the human element, slight panic, subtle gestures, a moment of carelessness, ensured the effect was fatal. You underestimated the fragility of her constitution. Sylvia Henshaw let out a soft breath. I had suspected, but could not prove. I only observed. Yes, Miss Marple said. And your observation, though indirect, helped uncover the subtle clues. The cup, the spoon, the sugar bowl, all ordinary, yet all revealing the chain of events. Captain Fenwick. Your nervous energy and minor smudge showed unconscious involvement. You were a witness, not the actor. The rest of the village's minor gestures helped confirm the sequence. Inspector Garland took notes quietly, nodding at Miss Marple's summary. Everything is clear then. Miss Ware, you will need to accompany us for questioning. Eleanor Ware nodded, finally acknowledging the inevitability. Her composure was broken, but she followed without resistance. Miss Marple allowed the hall to settle into silence once more. And now, she said softly, we understand the consequences. Mrs. Trent's death was sudden, yet the mystery is resolved. The smallest details revealed what words alone could not. The truth was in the gestures, the objects, and the subtle shifts in behaviour. Observation, patience, and careful attention to human nature uncovered what was hidden beneath ordinary appearances. The inspector addressed the remaining villagers. You have all been witnesses to the truth. Justice has been served, and the matter is concluded. There is no need for further speculation. Captain Fenwick let out a long breath. It's astonishing how much could be learned from such small things. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Small things, Captain, are often the greatest teachers. They reveal what is ordinary and what is extraordinary. In this village, manners and politeness conceal much, but not everything. Sylvia Henshaw approached Miss Marple. And the village? Will it ever feel the same? Perhaps not, Miss Marple said gently. Some truths leave behind scars and some habits of secrecy linger. Yet the ordinary life of Wych Elm will continue. People will talk, reflect, and sometimes forget. But what happened today teaches caution. The ordinary can hide danger, and careful observation is the only way to see it clearly, Dr. Ware joined her side. You always see more than anyone else, Miss Marple. I only notice, she said softly, and sometimes the smallest observations are enough to illuminate the entire picture. The villagers slowly dispersed, carrying with them the awareness of the day's revelations. The church hall returned to quiet order, though the tension lingered like a faint echo. Outside, the village green glowed golden in the last light of the afternoon, peaceful and untouched, masking the drama that had occurred within. Miss Marple paused at the door, taking one final look at the tea table. The cup fragment, the spoon, the sugar bowl, all had fulfilled their purpose in the story. Nothing remained unexplained. Every clue, gesture and interaction had been accounted for. She turned away, walking toward the edge of the green. The village would heal in its own way, secrets now exposed, justice quietly served. And in the heart of Wych Elm, human nature had once again shown itself, flawed, fragile, but ultimately illuminated by patient observation. The mystery was complete. All questions had answers, all clues accounted for. There were no loose ends, no ambiguity. The ordinary life of the village would resume, yet with the quiet knowledge that beneath the polite surfaces human intentions and subtle acts had left a permanent mark. Miss Marple's blue eyes, calm and reflective, lingered for a moment on the cottages bathed in evening light. The world remained ordinary, yet extraordinary truths had been revealed in its smallest details, and with that she walked home, content that justice had been served, the web of human actions understood, and every mystery laid bare.